Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSat network. Our topic of discussion today is part of our series on American literature. As friends, we have already discussed the beginnings of American English yesterday. We shall be taking it further, and today's lecture is Beginnings of American English Part 2. For this lecture, we have thus in our studio the same subject expert, Dr. Bhim Singh Daya, former Vice Chancellor, Kurukshetra University, and also Professor, Kurukshetra University, the Faculty of English, and he is also the Chief Editor of the Journal of Drama Studies and the Journal of Literature Studies. With this introduction, I would like to welcome Sir and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, Sir.
Thank you. Well, yesterday we covered the elementary aspects of the initial growth, the early phase of American English, how it became different from the British English, because largely it were the Englishmen who came there, and how that very language got transformed into a new kind of language because of new conditions of life. Now today we will try to go into larger issues which get involved in the development of a language, and also the deeper dimensions of those larger influences that come about because of peculiar conditions of every people whose language it is, which is spoken by them, which is used by them. Well, even though America came into being during the period of the Renaissance, but the historical periods cannot be sharply demarcated, because when from medievalism to Renaissance the development took place, it doesn't mean that all that was there during the medieval ages got obliterated. After all, habits, values, thinking, all of these things in one form or another, strongly or in dilute form, they do continue. New things keep coming, but old things also keep persisting. So one of the things which persisted from the medieval era was the biblical thought. Americans in particular who came to the new continent, they were the ones who were driven out of Europe. They were Protestants by and large, but devout, religious people. So they always thought of life in theological terms, and they thought theological values were the governing values of life. So that was a very great impact on these people who came here, which cannot be said of the British who lived behind. Now, if you remember, I give you a recent example. When the Gulf War took place, American invasion of Iraq, you remember how this Junior Bush, he was, explaining America's case to his people. And he was describing Saddam Hussein. But the language he uses is the biblical language. He paints Saddam as Satan, and how the devil he called him devil. How the devil hid himself in a hole and so on and so forth, and how he was dragged out. So what I mean to say is that it is so deep rooted in the American character that even today, after 300 years or 400 years of their settlement, their language predominantly carries that impact of the Bible, of theology. They think in terms of theology. So that impact of medievalism continued in America. Now that can be seen in their language, because after all there have to be sources of language. Where is it derived from? So here one of the sources of American English was Bible itself. Even as late as Hemingway, who was writer in the early 20th century, between the two world wars, and he participated in both the wars. So he became, in the English speaking world, the master stylist of English prose, modern prose, 20th century prose. And when he was asked about the influence on his prose, the first source he mentioned was the Bible. He said the Bible stories which I read, because they have the clean English prose, simple, straight, direct, and without any embellishment, without any ornamentation, without any indirections. So all that, he says, I learned from that. So what I mean to say is that the impact of Bible on the Americans was so strong that it continues even today. That is one influence, and this can be said to be the persistence of the medieval life or medieval element in American life. Now the other influence, I would say, was Renaissance. Renaissance also contributed towards the making of American English, because America was created during the period of the Renaissance. 1607 is the precise date when the settlement began, and Renaissance, 14th and 15th century. England was the last to have Renaissance. It started in Italy, from Italy to Germany to France to England, so it took quite a while. So even as late as 16th century, when Henry VIII was the King of England, then the Renaissance was taking place. That's why these writers like Philip Sidney, Thomas White, then Marlowe, Shakespeare, Sidney, these were called the Renaissance writers. So that was 16th century. Whereas in Italy, it had ended in the 15th century, because it had started much earlier in the 14th itself. All these Renaissance painters and sculptors of Italy, they were in the 14th and 15th centuries. But in England, it is the 16th. Now, one thing about Renaissance was the scientific outlook. You see, medievalism was not scientific. That was anti-science. In fact, scientists were burnt alive. They were killed. Even Galileo and Copernicus, they had to face hostility from the rulers, because they were scientists and new ideas had no place there. But they thought it was a challenge to their religious life. But then during 2 centuries, 14th and 15th, a Renaissance spirit established itself, which means the scientific spirit. And that is why the American language has its impact, because those who came to America were explorers. They were scientists in a way, because they were exploring new lands. And then they will write back home letters. And in those letters also, if one studies the language, one finds the influence of science. They try to describe the real objects they saw, things, and in the language which is precise, accurate. So this influence of science went into the making of American language also, because it became more realistic, more naturalistic, whereas at that very time in England it was a romantic period. So romantic imagination, fantasy, so on and so forth. But here they were practicing naturalism, realism, which came later there in the end of the 19th century. So this spirit of the explorers, this scientific eye for observing things and recording them scientifically. Now this influence also went into the making of American English. So this is another dimension to the American English. Another thing was Reformation, because medieval Christianity was Catholic, Old Testament. That was the Bible they followed. But then came the Reformists. You remember Martin Luther and Calvin. These were the two crusaders for a new Bible, New Testament. And they were obviously rationalists. They wanted to interpret Bible in terms of reason, logic, because that was the influence of the Greek thought, Aristotle, Plato, and so on. So this influence on the Christian religion, it came through these reformists, Martin Luther and Calvin. Those who came to America, they were the followers of Calvin largely. Martin Luther had greater impact in Germany. He himself was a German. But Calvin had greater influence in England, although he was not Englishman. He was from Scandinavian countries, but closer to them. Hence, most English-speaking population that migrated to America in the 17th century, they were Calvinists. And in a way, because they were Puritans, they were rationalists. So this aspect of rationalism again gets imbibed into the American English, which is more interpretative. Whereas simultaneously in England, the language at that time was not so much scientific and interpretative. It was more romantic, fantastic, imaginative. The best prose was considered to be the one which had these elements of fantasy, imagination, and so on. Ornamentation, more or less. So to magnify things rather than see them precisely as they are. So this again became a part of Americanism in the English language. Now some of the things, some peculiarities which you notice in daily conversation, like the Americans will not say A to Z, they'll say A to Z. So different. Now, similarly, they'll not say NT, they'll say anti-America or anti-this or anti-that. Similarly, they make, you see, O sounds more and more liquid and prolonged, whereas the British has a tendency to shorten the sounds. Half the sounds you at times don't even hear, because they do it. They will eat up some of the sounds. But the Americans prolong them, lengthen them. So these are some of the peculiarities that come about because of these conditions. And then, of course, another influence which gradually comes about, these people who came from England, there were two peculiarities about them. One, their mercantile interest, business. Secondly, they were middle class. So this impact of the middle class care for refinement, for culture, for sophistication, that also goes into the language. And then their business interest. So much so you must have noticed when the British says, "How do you do?" the reply is either fine or "How do you do?" again, you will ask back. But the Americans will say, "Business as usual." So life is described as business as usual. How do you do? Business as usual. So business becomes ingrained into the American character, and that had its impact on the vocabulary also. So business vocabulary, of course, gradually business took over America. Today it has taken over the whole world. All your multinationals, big business, this is in America. And obviously it is they, not so much politics. Politicians, don't you really see them? Even the President of America is not very overwhelming, but businesses, you can see the impact in any country, any corner. It may be Africa or Asia, it is American business. So obviously the business vocabulary then has to dominate, even in your private life, even in your social life. And finally, it is going to influence the language that you write, that you read, that you speak. So this also became a part of Americanism. More and more is a influence of business language. Well, then when homogenization takes place, as I said, after 1865, the Civil War, then English came to dominate. Other languages were silenced. They were stopped. They were not allowed to be used officially in education anywhere. So obviously when one language is imposed on the entire population, which was varied, which was diverse, because as I told you, they came from different countries. The Dutch came, the Germans came, the French came, Portuguese came. These were primarily the four, besides the British, the fifth one. These nationalities came, and during 17th and 18th century, even part of the 19th, as I told you, they continued to have their own, say, community life, their own language, their own literature, and their own culture. So, as I mentioned yesterday, they were more of disunited states of America rather than the United States. But then all that ended after 1865. Then it became the United States of America with one common language and one common culture and one common politics. Now everything changed. But then, as I mentioned earlier, life does not change with the switch of your button. There are habits, there are thinkings, there are values which keep persisting. So these different states which were disunited, and they had their territories well defined. Like the Germans were Pennsylvania based. Similarly, French had their different territory, so on and so forth. So when all that was merged and was forced into amalgamation, obviously you may have to curb your language officially, but unofficially it will be yours, because language doesn't die again with your wishes. It continues. And they were using their language privately in home and so on. And when it became one and amalgamation took place, more and more give and take also takes place. So if the languages were discontinued officially, they got absorbed unofficially into English itself, because every language has its own characteristics. Every language has its own strong points. Every language has more convenient words and expressions for the same object. So whichever language you find then, or whichever word or expression you find convenient, you adopt it. So from French, from Dutch, from Spanish, a lot of words got absorbed. For example, there are words from different languages which got absorbed there. Yeah, here it is. For example, the Dutch words include scow, S-C-O-W, scow, hook, H-O-O-K, sleigh, S-L-E-I-G-H, stoop, S-T-O-O-P, span, S-P-A-N, cookie, which we use even today, spook, S-P-O-O-K, then boss, Santa Claus, all these are Dutch words, but they got absorbed into English and we use them now. And most conspicuous of the Dutch words, as I told you, was Yankee.
Yankee.
So Americans are known Yankee now. popularly known as Yankees. Then you see many other words came from other languages also, and many were invented. Among the invented ones, for example, which were not there in English, was bluegrass. The word was not there, but they saw in America new grass, so they had to name it, so they named it bluegrass. Similarly, catbird, a new kind of bird they saw. They didn't have any name in English, so they gave it catbird. Similarly, they saw a new frog and gave it a name, tree frog, which again is a new word, tree frog. And similarly, new kind of snake, garter snake, Garter, garter snake. And then backwoods. Then slippery elm, ELM. And buckshot, spring house, hoe cake, HOE, hoe cake. So you can see how new words and old words from different languages, they also became part of Americanism. Now the British English would continue with their original ones, but in America all this will go into. America is a much larger country, variety of ecology, variety of agriculture, crops, variety of people. So it becomes more and more dynamic language, which British is not. Of course, now after the empire, British also had that benefit of having exposure all over the world, and therefore from all over the world absorbing influences from different languages. So that's how languages get enriched. So Americanisms have their own peculiarities, which have come from different sources. I mentioned some of them, but not all. It requires a lot more to go into the depth of English study. But then for a layman, I mean for general student of English, this is good enough, unless you want to become a linguist, a specialist of American English, then of course. But popular peculiarities, I told you, class, not class.
Yes.
Anti, not anti, and so on, lengthening O sounds, etc., etc. Anyway, I think enough for my side. Now you can have your queries,
Right.
questions.
Thank you, sir. In fact, a very interesting lecture, and as you told us at the end that American English then became a very dynamic language, and we also received examples from you, like how from Dutch we have such words that we do not even question once to think whether they are Dutch words or English words, because they come to us naturally, in the sense that, such as cookie and Santa Claus. So they appear to us as English words itself, and we don't realize that they have been borrowed from another language.
Yes.
And perhaps there might be so many other words, because like you said, there were other settlers, French, Portuguese, Dutch. So again, a give and take between the different languages.
Yeah, it was very natural. It
Right.
had to take place. because the British did not have this benefit of having very different people. Of course, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, but their dialects were not very different from the English. Here they come with very strong traditions of their own. French, for example, had stronger tradition than English.
Right.
And German still more. German, in fact, is closer to our Sanskrit in grammar and even vocabulary. Dutch also, Portuguese. So all these, you see, combined, they came to have a great influence on the American language. You see, that reminds me of another very important difference between the two. British English is more inward looking, and it's a sort of conservatism. The British would not easily, you see, change, would not easily come out also. Unless you are introduced, for example, he will not speak to you. You don't know each other. But on the contrary, American, anybody they come across, hello, how do you do? This,
Yes.
They are outgoing. Whereas the British are, you see, conservative, keep to themselves, very formal. Now, American English is informal. Outgoing, extrovert, whereas the British is more introvert, conservative, touch me not kind of thing.
Yes.
The Americans are tourists, travelers. Even now you will see most people, see the white travelers, they are Americans.
Yes.
So when you are outgoing, you become outspoken also. You'll talk to people. The very fact that you are going out, you have a curiosity to see the world, to meet people, to talk to them. The British would not. Even if you are traveling by train, I used to experience sitting side by side, they will not talk to you. Even if you try to, they say, no, we have not been introduced. So who you are, they will not talk to you. So that big difference, see, comes out in the language
also.
After all, language expresses your character.
Absolutely.
Your thoughts, your emotions, your feelings. So all that has to come out in language.
Absolutely, sir. And I was just curious to know that when this give and take of words happened, of course, this must have been an official agreement to have included some Dutch words in the American dictionary. So were there any committees formed, or was this just some kind of an approval from the other side to include these words?
Well, the first entry of words is always informal.
Right.
And unofficial. The people are talking to each other from different backgrounds, trying to communicate with each other, and obviously some words of your own would slip into it. Then the other person becomes curious, tries to know. So first the absorption of non-English words happened unofficially. So it became part of the dialect, like the Red Indians languages, then French, German, etc. So a lot of words became a part of your working vocabulary, which you need in day-to-day life. So first comes the dialect, then comes language, which is more formal because it has a script, it has alphabets, it is written. So, what you are saying, committees and official taking stock of these words, that came about after World War II. Things got formalized there. So, it took almost a century because English was imposed in 1865, but World War ended in 1945. So, after 80 years, things started to be formalized.
Right.
Then regular official dictionaries, committees. Now, if you look up the Oxford Dictionary, for example, it will give you a list of 200 or odd, say, scholars who have, say, contributed to the preparation of the dictionary.
Right.
So now you have those committees, you have those
people,
for
the names.
yes.
Right, thank you, sir. And just would like to know how we talked about the process of homogenization that happened after the Civil War of 1865, that a common language, culture and politics that was imposed, but I would like to know, was there any kind of resistance also from these groups?
Yeah, of course, because it's a very painful experience to get deprived of your language,
Yes.
or your culture or your way of life, any sort of imposition. First, it is human nature. That's why we speak of freedom, because any kind of imposition is against your grain. Obviously, you react, you feel uneasy, you feel troubled, you feel pained. This also reminds me of another Americanism. There is greater influence in the American English of rhetoric. The British are not really rhetoricians, but the Americans are.
Yes.
One reason is, as I said, these Calvinists, Puritans, each one of them was like a preacher. They were so, obsessed with their new religion. Each one was a sort of preacher. So the preacher's idiom is always rhetorical, because you have to hammer things into the heads of people gathered there. So you will be repeating things. So repetition is one of the very strong devices of rhetoric.
Absolutely.
So you must have seen the American president repeating things in a rhythm. We will not do this, we will not do that, we will not do that. Bush or whoever, they use rhetoric. Now this is typical American. Even in their language, formal, literary language, you find greater influence of rhetoric. And they consciously adopted. You see, when America's settlement came about in 17th century, and after 1865 in particular, the language policy they adopted, they made rhetoric as a very important subject of study in education. In the American universities, colleges, even schools, rhetoric was taught, just as the Greeks and Romans used to do in olden times. Now the Americans were doing it because they thought now they will also have the kind of empire the Romans had. So that dream of becoming the Romans brought them to this. And in Rome, during the Roman Empire days, those centuries, You find education primarily among the Romans was education of rhetoric. The Roman plays in Shakespeare, for example, they stand out in terms of the rhetoric that Shakespeare uses. Remember those speeches by Brutus, by Antony, by Cassius, and a sort of competition, and each one trying to excel the other in the use of rhetoric. Similarly, Coriolanus, Antony and Cleopatra. Even Cleopatra excels others in the use of rhetoric. So rhetoric is another aspect of American English which is much stronger there than in British English. Yeah, excuse me, it reminds me of another important difference. You see, these Calvinists, these Puritans who came to America were mercantile in their outlook and middle class. And both you will find, and then of course Bible quoting Protestants, they had strong gender bias because a woman for them was either a daughter or a wife, nothing beyond. No third role was acceptable to them. So first you are a daughter, then you are a wife, which means both subordinate positions. There your father would decide things, here your husband would decide things. So this, you see, male dominated ethos, way of life, it gets reflected in language also. You will find more masculinity in the American English than in the British. So they are more masculine, even muscular, which the British is not. British will lay more emphasis on refinement, sophistication, softness, not the American. In fact, they will like it better if it is rough and
more rustic.
Yes. So masculinity of English is another trait of Americanism.
Right. It's a very interesting point that you shared with us, sir. And just that we were talking about the homogenization, and of course there's a great deal of diversity in the kinds of people that live there, from Asians to Africans and to Indonesians, but irrespective of that, there's a very interesting kind of a unity, and it's also remarkable to note that these words from different languages were, although adopted in the dictionary, there was no kind of a mainstream resistance to have made their language any kind of official or state language. So I think that is of
resistance always is, but the question is power. Whoever is more powerful, whoever is more dominant, obviously would have his way. So the British had their way. Now, talking of the British character, the Englishman's character, E.M. Foster has an essay on the English character. And Sherlock Holmes, if you have been reading Sherlock Holmes, one quality that he underlines in the English character is tenacity. And tenacity always wins. You see, Napoleon was very powerful militarily, even as a fighter himself. And England got the beating for many years, but finally they defeated him.
Yes.
Tenacity. The whole world was subdued and subjugated by Hitler. 6 years, imagine. The first invasion was of Poland, September 1, 1939, and it continued right up to 45. Of course, the Americans ended it. But then, who showed the tenacity? For 6 years, the British, the whole country was devastated, destroyed. London, even including Parliament. Churchill is standing in Parliament without a roof, addressing his members and saying the same thing. We'll fight here, we'll fight there, we'll fight everywhere, but we'll not surrender. The French surrendered in a day. The British did not for 6 years. And ultimately, they defeated Hitler also, as they had defeated Napoleon. So this tenacity is a characteristic of the English character. And that becomes a characteristic of the language also. So they believe in tenacity. Americanism has masculinity, but not tenacity. They keep changing. It can be brittle also, breaks very easily. The American will throw it away, all right. If this doesn't work, something else will work, but not the English. He would not easily leave his tradition. So he is more tradition bound.
Right.
So their language is also more tradition bound, which Americanism is not. So it has both sides, good as well as bad.
Right.
The good side is that it is flexible. It is more open. It absorbs greater number of influences. But weakness is, again, that it quickly throws away things which the British would not.
Absolutely. And sir, as we were talking about these Puritans and Calvinists who came from England to the America, and how they were both mercantile and middle class, as we talked about this, I was curious to know how this aspect affected American English. And in fact, you have already answered my question by telling me that they held a strong gender bias as part of the middle class outlook, and they saw women only as daughters and wives in these categories. And of course, this aspect also reflected in the language that they used, as opposed to the British English, who emphasize more on refinement and sophistication. Right. So I think that point would also be reiterated for the students and even strengthened in their minds.
Yeah, certainly. You see, being mercantile minded, business minded, and at the same time being a member of the middle class is a very strange combination. Because you see, business mentality will not leave you conservative. Middle class by nature is conservative. It's not very daring. Daring is, as Robinson Crusoe says, see, either the very rich, they can afford losses, they can take risks, or the very low who is desperate, who has nothing to lose. He already doesn't have much. Therefore, they can be adventurous. Middle class is never adventurous. they will always keep to the middle path. So, no risks and no adventures, therefore, settled life, like going to office and coming back and having your routine. So, that is the middle class mentality. Now, in America, this ultimately got curbed because it cannot combine with business interests, it cannot combine with scientific interests, it cannot combine with the explorer's interests. Explorer has to be adventurous. You want to explore new and newer lands, new and newer people, cultures, languages. So ultimately, the middle class traits of these pioneer Americans, they gradually got eliminated.
Right.
And the other things, business traits, or the explorers' traits, or the scientists' traits, they came to dominate.
Right.
So finally, middle class values are out.
Right.
In American life as well as American language.
Right, absolutely, sir. And since we have very little time left, just to sort of recapitulate and also clarify, we saw in the beginning the kind of influences on American English that sir pointed out, that influence of Bible and that kind of persistence of that medieval element in the American life. Moving on, we saw how the Renaissance also contributed to the making of American English and providing the language a scientific outlook as opposed to medievalism, which saw science as a challenge to religious life, and the scientific spirit that developed and which was also seen in the kind of simple language that was being used. And then we also saw the influence of Reformation, and that is what we talked about. And just to discuss with you, sir, was this emphasis on making things simple deliberate, because we can see that in the way that things are spelled in American English are simpler than they are spelled in the British English.
Well, that again is the influence of two things. One, mercantile. You see, business-like attitude to language also, words. For example, in British English, many, you see, letters are there, but their sounds are not there. When you speak, you skip some of the letters. The Americans would not do that.
Yes.
They will spell every letter sound.
Yes, yes.
Every sound they will do that. The British will shorten and will have just key sounds. Now, this went into the American English a long way and made out a very big difference. That is why they have their own schedule.
Yes. Yes.
So every letter gets pronounced in American English. In British English, every sound doesn't have a place. They shorten it and make it whatever is convenient.
Right, and perhaps, sir, you must have also noted that the word R, the letter R, is quite prominent in American English as opposed to the British English. Perhaps British English, like you said, they try to hide or they try to make it more subtle, but the emphasis in American English is to make it more prominent.
Yes.
So that it becomes highlighted.
Yeah, because as I said, they are travelers, they are outgoing people, they are talkative. So obviously you have to be simpler.
Absolutely.
The British has to be subtle.
Yes.
So there are more subtleties in the British English, not so much in the American.
Right.
American is simpler, American is straight,
Right.
it is more outgoing and so on.
And can we also say that this kind of a subtlety is also because of their need to emphasize a certain refinement, a sophistication that they wanted to include in their language?
Yes. Nosy, I mean, no, not in this sense of poking your nose. That is generally the nosy. I saw in England picture called the nosy Indian.
Okay.
But the Britishers touch me not. That is his culture.
That is the culture, right. Absolutely. So, very wonderful and interesting discussion with you. So, friends, this was our 2 lectures on the beginnings of American English part 1 and 2, and I hope that you can make good use of it. In case you missed out on the last one, you could watch it on YouTube. And with this wonderfully done lecture, I'd like to thank sir. Thank you so much, sir. And thank you, friends, for watching. Have a great day.
Thank you.